All right, our next presenter is Naazneen Gill. She will be presenting on the research examining ecofeminism, contributions to the environmental justice movement. Her research advisor is Ms. Bartlett, and her by Mike.
Thank you so much for that introduction. So as Jason just mentioned, my presentation is on ecofeminism and its contributions to the environmental justice movement. So with that, I'm going to go right into my research question argument. My research centered on one key thing, ecofeminism, and how has ecofeminism contributed to environmental justice movements in the past, and how could it contribute to contemporary environmental justice initiatives? To answer this question, I did 3 case studies on 3 different environmental movements in 3 different contexts, and I came to the argument that ecofeminism has been used successfully in the past to expand environmental justice movements and can still be helpful today in creating effective environmental justice initiatives. So my first step in my research was defining ecofeminism, and it boiled down to 5 key tenets: anti-modernism, care, governance, equality, and disruption. What does this mean in the ecofeminist context? It means that ecofeminists critique patriarchal global organizations of patriarchy in legitimizing capitalist ventures, which have resulted in the joint subjugation of women and their environment over time. Ecofeminists critique an over-reliance on techno-scientific solutions to climate change in their anti-modern focus. They argue that having a patriarchal world ideology has led to an over-reliance on green technologies, green capitalism, and types of solutions like carbon capture to solve environmental crisis, rather than communities of care, which leads into my second tenet, which is care. Ecofeminists will not only argue that care for the environment is necessary, but also that care has been devalued and delegitimized using patriarchal ideologies of men's domination over women to legitimize the fact that care has to be free in order to fund capitalist ventures of exploitation, which leads to governance. Women have been excluded from spaces of governance in order to further capitalist exploitation of the environment. And women would argue that not only do women need access to these spaces of governance, but also that they've been excluded from these spaces of governance and need to find ways outside of these spaces to empower themselves to act, which leads to equality. Ecofeminists argue that equal ability to participate in these spaces is important, but also equal opportunities to make change and equal opportunities to participate in decision-making spaces, which they have not been able to do due to how patriarchy has delegitimized them and their contributions over time. This leads to disruption. Ecofeminists argue that the systems which have perpetuated climate degradation, like women's subjugation, have been perpetuated by the same global political, economic, and social system. Ecofeminists are inherently anti-capitalist, anti-patriarchal, and are advocating for a true democracy in which all groups are represented equally in their advocacy. So why ecofeminism? Women are 14 times more likely to die in a climate disaster than men, and 80% of the people forced to leave during climate disasters are women. Exclusion of women from environmental spaces of decision-making is what has led to this disproportionate impact on women throughout the world. 70% of presidents and chairs of the largest environmental organizations are men. 90% of the presidents of the largest conservation organizations with budgets at or exceeding $1 million are also men. 56% of the board members in environmental organizations are also men, whilst women make up 60% of new hires in these exact same organizations, but don't actually have access to the spaces where these decisions are made. Ecofeminists would argue that this is evidence of how patriarchal ideologies of men's domination over women has led to continued exclusion, has led to an over-reliance on techno-scientific solutions to climate change, and is part of the reason that we're struggling to find effective ways to combat this. That leads into my next point, which is environmental justice. Environmental justice and ecofeminism arose in tandem with each other, as can be seen through the anti-toxics movement. Anti-toxics relied on the contribution of women to further their goals. They relied on women's role as mothers to expand the movement, to further it, to achieve its goals. That had led to a synergy between the movements in the modern era. Both movements focus on increasing recognition, participation, and distribution. However, ecofeminism is particularly relevant to environmental justice in that it's always had a global positioning in how it viewed how communities have been marginalized over time. It has always viewed how global systems of patriarchy have legitimized capitalism and have led to the joint subjugation of marginalized communities and the environment. Therefore, when environmental justice scholars in the contemporary era are advocating for a more global positioning, it would be beneficial for them to look back to ecofeminism to see how these theories evolved and how they understood these global systems of inequality. That leads me to my first case study, which was the Greenbelt movement. The Greenbelt movement arose in 1977 in Kenya and was founded by Dr. Wangari Maathai, who believed that in order to empower women, in order to solve climate change, you needed to empower women. she intentionally focused her efforts on empowering women and ensuring that they gained equal access to spaces of decision-making in Kenya. Her tactic was a tree planting initiative. She implemented the tree planting initiative because she was listening to the needs of rural Kenyan women. Rural Kenyan women had been delegitimized in Kenyan society. Nobody was listening to their concerns. They said they couldn't get water. They had to walk miles and miles further than they ever had to walk before to get water. They had no access to firewood. Their soil quality was decreasing. They couldn't do the subsistence agriculture which was their role in their societies. However, they didn't know why this was happening. Dr. Mathai had the education. She understood that industrial agricultural initiatives, which were meant to fund capitalist global markets, were the reason that the local rural environments were degrading. So instead of finding ways that women could benefit from industrial agricultural initiatives, she looked at ways to strengthen the environment while empowering women. This is evident through her tree planting campaigns. Her tree planting campaigns paid women 4 US cents to plant trees. She did this in order to make women wage earners in their homes, because she recognized that the fact that women couldn't work outside the home was part of the reason that legitimized their submission in their home, their submission under their husband's own orders. It made them unable to advocate for themselves. It was part of the reason that their concerns about the environment had been ignored for so long. She also understood the need to create a solid base to expand the movement. And she did this through community education programs that centered on care for each other and care for the environment. She used this to gain a base so that women could advocate for themselves outside of spaces of governance, but also to gain access into these spaces. When they first started, the Green Belt movement was harshly repressed by the Kenyan government. They reacted violently to the advocacy of these women. But eventually, in the contemporary era, because of the work that they've done outside of governance structures, the Kenyan government has implemented 3 national policy goals to the betterment of women and the environment. So Dr. Mathai, with working outside of governance structures, empowering women economically, and using tree planting campaigns, was able to disrupt economic systems of exploitation by disrupting industrial agriculture schemes. She disrupted social systems of patriarchy by empowering women in their homes. And she reformed the Kenyan government to make sure it was a true democracy that benefited all people, not just the capitalist kind of global market. That leads into my second case study. The Chipko movement also arose in 1973, but very, very different in its initiation than the Green Belt movement. The Chipko movement was never meant to empower women. It's one of the most famous contemporary ecofeminist movements, but it was never meant to empower women. And that's because it was founded by 2 male environmentalists who went and they talked to male rural villagers in northern India. They did this because they wanted to preserve North Indian forests in the face, again, of industrial logging campaigns. When they went to go talk to these male villagers agreed. They didn't want the forest to be cut down. But the reason they didn't want the forest to be cut down was mainly because they weren't being compensated for the loss of the forest. A totally valid complaint. I mean, it was their forest. They should be able to benefit from it. But what they didn't talk to female villagers. This is the key part of the Chipko movement. Female villagers had an ancient and practical relationship with the forest. They were natural resource managers in these communities. They understood the value of the forest beyond a solely economic one. They understood the value of protecting it just for the sake of protecting it. Because not only did women work closely with it, they understood that forests allow for water retention. They understood the needs, the ecosystem services that the forest provided. And they showed this by caring for the forest. Tree hugging was an ancient practice in North India. And it might sound very spiritual and kind of like not very modern in our age, but it was effective. And that through tree hugging, they were able to stop multinational corporate interventions of logging. It was because of the women who stood in the forest and hugged these trees and tied bracelets around them that multinational logging corporations had to leave North India. They were ready to go chop down the forest. They'd agreed with the male villagers. They'd come to a payout. It was because of the women and the care for the recognition of the intrinsic value of the forest that this movement was successful. Now, very different from the Green Belt movement. These women were not economically empowered to do this. They actually rejected profit. They stood in direct opposition to their husbands in their rejection of this profit. They made themselves equal decision makers. And far beyond that, they became these sole decision makers in what happened to the forest. Today, that North Indian forest is protected because the women refused to leave. In doing this, they fundamentally restructured patriarchal notions of what women were allowed to do in this society. They were no longer, I mean, they were still perceived as submissive, but they had fought to not be perceived that way. They disrupted the interests fundamentally of capitalist logging expeditions, and they also stood in direct opposition to the Indian government, which was a huge thing for women to do at the time. Leading to my third case study, the Sunrise Movement, which is very different because it was founded in 2016 and not the 1970s. It is a youth-based climate movement, which engages very heavily with principles of environmental justice. It it's very different for two main reasons. First, the fact that it's a youth-based movement, and second is that it pursued national level policy change. It did not organize in grassroots local communities to respond to the local needs of marginalized individuals. Even though one of the Sunrise's key tenets is that it does do this for communities, it never actually went into these communities and did that. So it's very different from the other two movements that I've just discussed. The primary goal of the Sunrise Movement was the implementation of the Green New Deal. The Green New Deal pursued a pathway towards eco-socialist modernization in the United States. Again, this means investment in green technology, investment in job creation, a great path forward, but the Sunrise Movement didn't actually have the base, did not have a knowledge of how anti-modernism would work in the same way, and was kind of faltered after the Green New Deal failed to pass in Congress. This is largely by critics of the Sunrise Movement after they failed, been reduced to the fact that they did not actually engage in meaningful ways with local communities. So they did not embrace the ethic of care as the Greenbelt movement did, as the ChipGo movement did. They were just advocating for the communities. They didn't actually create a solid base because they didn't interact with these communities. They lacked an ethic of care. They do advocate for equality. That was one of the main reasons for the Green New Deal. They believed the Green New Deal was a way to combat the climate crisis, to combat social inequality, to combat racism, all in one, basically. So they do have a good theory of equality, but again, slightly different to what the ChipGo and the Green Movement were doing. In terms of governance, they work directly within systems of governance. They are completely reliant on systems of governance. Originally, in their original iteration, the Sunrise Movement won. They went straight to the national level. They sat in Speaker Pelosi's office. They talked to Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. That was their main strategy. And when that didn't work, they struggled to recalibrate. This past year, they've relaunched an initiative called Sunrise 2.0, where again, they're still working within government structures, but they're working on the local level. So they are responding. They understand that they needed a more care-based approach. And they're also working on recruiting a more diverse base of constituents, working with these local communities. They're not working against governance, they're working within it, but they're doing it to reform it to achieve their goals. Disruption. They're not really disrupting the social, economic, and political systems in the same way as Greenbelt and ChipGo were. They're reforming them to work and achieve their goals. They are reforming the political system. They're trying to work to ensure the political system creates solutions to the climate crisis that are equitable. They are working to reform capitalism so that it doesn't only benefit some and that it benefits all. They're also working, and they are disrupting social systems of inequality, not patriarchal systems only, but systems of racism, patriarchy, etc. That leads me to my takeaways. So ecofeminism and environmental justice, they show up in Greenbelt and ChipGo in similar ways. And it's important to note that both the Greenbelt and the ChipGo movement arise in similar social, political, and economic contexts. So the context matters when talking about these movements. But the fact of the matter is they helped move these movements forward. The Greenbelt movement is still a prominent environmental social movement in Kenya today. They're still making greenbelts within the country. As I mentioned before, they created 3 national policy goals centered on the well-being of women and the environment. ChipGo has this legacy has continued. The North Indian forest remains untouched. Multinational logging companies cannot go there. The Indian government cannot use it. It's there and it's preserved for the needs of rural villagers. They do not show up in the same way in the Sunrise Movement, and that's because it was not part of the theories of change in Sunrise. However, as I mentioned before, Sunrise really struggled after the failure of the Green New Deal. They struggled to recalibrate. They're trying to relaunch themselves. And in doing so, they themselves acknowledge that they need to engage in a more meaningful way with the communities that they represent. They need a local base. They need to integrate, they need to use care, and they need to understand how to pursue eco-socialist modernization, which is where anti-modernism and governance and all the rest of the tactics I just talked about come in. So conclusion, social, political, and economic contexts matter when talking about these movements, but movements could be more effective if they engage with eco-feminist tenets of anti-modernism, care, governance, equality, and economic social disruption, political disruption, regardless of when and where they arise. It's not just me that's saying this. Contemporary ecofeminists agree. Contemporary environmental justice advocates agree. Ecofeminism is uniquely positioned to help these movements, as can be seen in the Sunrise Movement. And with engaging with these tenets, these movements can find a way to create real sustainable change to achieve their goals. It's very important. And I want to say a huge thank you to Professor Bartlett for all of her time and help throughout this project, and also Professor Klein for all of his help and editing. Thank you.
We've learned about ChipGo. No, that's it. I'm wondering, having done this senior, right? About
Oh, that's a really good question. I think it has. I think it really has changed my perspective. I think when I came in, I myself didn't understand ecofeminism. I also thought I actually wanted to explore because I had an issue with how it had been presented to me in my women and gender studies classes. That was like women are biologically connected to the earth because we have children. I was like, there's no way that can be true. And so, I mean, I just like wasn't because I don't feel like I'm not a huge nature person, as most people know. So I was like, I feel like it can't be true, but at least I'm evidence of the exception. So that informed my original thinking, and it has informed how I thought about what I might want to do going forward in terms of like, it taught me new ways to think about economics, politics, social disruption. And I think it has kind of informed what I want to do. I mean, I'm going to grad school. I hope to study it more. I think one thing that this project could have benefited from was more time to really deeply engage. I mentioned that context matters. And that was something that I learned very, very late in the project. And I think I would love to learn more about how context affects these things and like what larger systems of inequality kind of do to contribute to it. Oh, thank you. Oh, sorry. Thank you. You actually got it. One of like my key things. The livelihood thing is a key component. That's why ecofeminism manifests so differently in India and Kenya. Those are countries that have been not, I don't want to say more directly impacted, because you are just as impacted if you live in a global north country, but as you mentioned, in a more tangible way. So that informed their tactics. They had to find a way to live and maintain their ecosystem. Now, Sunrise, still being impacted by climate change at a more national level. However, they kind of lacked the kind of thinking in that they didn't understand how capitalism and those kinds of things still impact people on the like local level. And that was an issue that they had to like perpetuate, like continuing their movement. But that's a very key point. Livelihoods and how livelihoods are impacted really, really matter in the how ecofeminism shows up in different contexts. Yeah.
So place in the US where like are like no financial, like a lot of people are seats of power and do not have their hands like and resources. That's not really reliable. Do you think that impact environmental justice and environmental movements like if so, how do you think like how can you pass that?
No, that's a really good point. Yeah, so I think that is definitely part of it. I think the difference in economic kind of status, I don't know how else to say that, is a really key part of why these movements chose to pursue the tactics that they chose to pursue. As I mentioned, kind of like with Greenbelt and Chipko, women couldn't get the water that they needed. They couldn't get their firewood. They were like, their environment was changing around them. They weren't tangibly related. And again, in the Sunrise, it's not that much of an issue because they're not working directly within these environments, but their environment is still being impacted. And they're claiming to advocate for communities in the United States that are disproportionately affected. I don't think it's necessarily an obstacle. I think it has to do with reframing how Sunrise is approaching what they're doing, because they're doing really, really good work, but they're focusing too much on like national level policy. And I think that, as you mentioned, is a symptom of the economic context in which they arose. They've largely benefited from capitalism, even though capitalism affects livelihoods negatively in the US. On this whole, as you mentioned, it largely benefits them. And it's hard to see those direct impacts, which is probably why which is actually, I think, confirmed why the Sunrise movement chose a national scale movement rather than kind of working with local communities.
Yeah.